Welcome. Hopefully this will work. This is the first time I've done a podcast for a class, but I feel like it's a good way for me to finish up World War II with you guys and get you ready for your test coming up. So bear with me. This is a new thing, but thank you for listening. We're going to start off today talking about United States involvement in World War II. So the main idea, as I've listed here, is the involvement of the United States in World War II, while opposed by most Americans prior to Pearl Harbor, will vault us into global political and military prominence. World War II is going to transform both American society, and it's going to transform our relationship with the rest of the world. Essentially, what we're going to see in the next few minutes is that the United States, first, is going to be launched into a time period where rights for minorities and for women are going to take center stage, largely because of the role that minorities and women played during World War II. So it's going to change a lot there in the social, cultural aspects of the U.S. It's also going to end this myth of isolationism that we've been talking about. The idea that we could remain separate from European affairs, that we could, remain in the ideology of Washington's farewell address, that we remain out of European affairs, out of entangling alliances. That's going to end. We are no longer going to be able to fool ourselves into thinking that we can be an isolationist nation after World War II is over. Really, after World War I was over, we emerged as a global leader. However, we did not want to be the global leader at that point, so we kind of shirked our responsibility in the 20s and 30s, to be honest. But after World War II, we will essentially take responsibility, take a stand, and become a global leader. Before we get into all that, though, I want to talk a little bit about why it is important for you guys to be paying attention to me today, and just in general, why you should pay attention to history. So that you can be a generally educated citizen and not make a fool of yourself. In the 2014 Olympics, there were a lot of protesters surrounding that event, saying that the United States should not be involved in the Sochi, Russia Olympics because of all of the human rights violations that are carried out under the Putin regime. And this was one sign that was held up in one of the protests against the Sochi Olympics. And hopefully you understand why this sign is funny and somewhat foolish, rather foolish in fact, because would we have allowed Nazi Germany to host the Olympics? Yes, in fact we did, just as we allowed Putin's Russia to host the Olympics. We do not let concerns of human rights violations really get in the way of our athletic spectacles. However, before the United States went to the Olympics in 1936, we had really been in a time of isolationism. We, as I said before, we did not want to confront the issues going on abroad. We wanted to ignore it. So the fact that we joined the Olympics, that we entered an Olympic team in the 1936 Olympics should not be surprising, because most Americans really felt that it wasn't our job to get involved politically with international affairs. The Olympics is sort of something that is supposed to be apolitical. And so we got involved there and sent a very successful U.S. team. Jesse Owens was one of them. He's pictured here, along with Louis Zamperini. And there was just recently a movie made about his life, not only as an Olympian, but in World War II, a book and a movie made about the life of Louis Zamperini as well was on that team. So the 1936 Olympics is really just kind of a great example of how American isolationism prevailed, and we maintained our political and somewhat economic isolationism and did not want to confront the growing problems abroad. So this gets us into some ideas here surrounding isolationism, and we'll spend a minute talking about that. Basically, isolationism before World War I was fueled by a few individuals, and a lot of Americans in society kind of did jump on the isolation boat. Before World War II, as events were turning in Europe, as you see the rise of fascist regimes, you see the rise of military dictatorships, it was a scary time for Americans. Because we had been so traumatized by World War I, and we didn't want to get involved. And one of the major players in this will be Gerald Nye, who starts up the committee on the Nye Committee, and he and some fellow what's called revisionist historians, people that sort of study history with an agenda to prove, decide to look at the motives for going into World War I. And they conclude that World War I was largely initiated by the United States. Our involvement in World War I was largely to serve the greed of bankers. As you may remember, we had a lot of U.S. industrialists that were making loans to the nations at war, both sides at the beginning, and a lot of Americans, a lot of wealthy Americans did very well making loans to the nations at war. And the Nye Committee essentially concludes that it was a war to help the rich get richer. So let's not do that again, is the idea. And this idea sort of filters down throughout a lot of American people. Congress at the time passes the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts are a series of acts that are intended to prevent us from getting involved in another war. And it's going to essentially do this by preventing the things that got us involved in World War I. So for instance, World War I, one of the things that got us involved was the fact that we had economic ties to France and Great Britain. So the Neutrality Acts forbids the sale of arms or loans to nations at war. Another thing that got us involved in World War I was the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania. So the Neutrality Acts forbids American citizens from riding on belligerents' ships. As you hopefully remember, a belligerent is a nation at war, and the Lusitania was a British ship at the time, a belligerent. So hopefully the Neutrality Acts, according to the thinking of many American politicians, hopefully the Neutrality Acts will prevent us from getting entangled in another European conflict. It does prevent us from intervening in the Spanish Civil War, and you see as a result of that the rise of a fascist regime in Spain. However, many do not see the Neutrality Acts and our pretend isolationism at the time as going far enough. Charles Lindbergh, you remember, he was the popular hero from the 1920s who made that transatlantic flight. He becomes prominent in the 1930s with his America First Committee, and this is a committee that largely opposes FDR and what he perceives to be FDR's very pro-British policies. So what are we talking about here? Well, first off, if you remember, in the 1930s, there was a series of invasions. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. Hitler invaded the Rhineland, which is a region bordering France. He also invaded the Sudetenland, which is in Czechoslovakia. And the United States, the European powers pretty much looked on and didn't do much of anything. League of Nations same thing, didn't really do much of anything. In 1937, China invaded Japan. FDR at this time really is looking over from across the pond and really perceiving, you know, which government is the strongest at this time? Well, it's not Britain, it's not France, it's certainly not the League of Nations. And so he issues a pretty harsh speech in which he says we need to quarantine the aggressor. However, most Americans at this time do not want us quarantining the aggressor. They don't want us getting involved with the aggressor. They want us to focus on domestic issues, which in the 1930s, we are still in the midst of the Great Depression. And they're basically saying, you know, FDR, don't get into entangling alliances. We're keeping that myth of isolationism alive. However, the United States government does launch a preparedness campaign. Congress will increase our budgets at FDR's request, and FDR will find very creative ways to chip away at the Neutrality Act, the first of which being cash and carry, which is a way for us, the United States, to provide Britain with war materials as long as Britain pays for the war materials with cash and carries them away on their own ships. This prevents our merchant ships from being sunk in the process of this war. The Destroyers for Bases deal, similar way that FDR will chip away at neutrality. This will provide Britain with old naval destroyers that they can then refurbish. In exchange, we get access to some bases on their islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. The Selective Service Act was also initiated at this time. This will begin a draft. All males 18 and older must register for the draft. Now, the draft does not begin. People are not actually being drafted until after Pearl Harbor, but the registration is begun at this time. You will also remember from our discussion on the 1920s that the United States, while we were trying to be isolationist, we did get involved in several treaties at the Washington Naval Conference. The United States and all the other major, we'll call them great powers at the time, the major industrial powers, agreed to limit the growth of their navies. We agreed to protect the territorial integrity of China and other parts of Asia. So basically, we all agreed not to invade territories in Asia. However, you'll notice one country that features prominently on all three of these treaties, and that country is Japan. And as you know by now, Japan did not honor any of these agreements. The League of Nations had very little enforcement power, and it was actually the United States and the Stimson Doctrine that came down the most strongly on Japan when Japan invaded China in 1937. However, despite our very harsh Stimson Doctrine condemning Japan's invasion of China, refusing to recognize their regime at Manchukuo, which is what they call their Japanese-held regions of China. Despite that, Japan continues to invade Southeast Asia. Now, one of the major reasons why they're invading Southeast Asia is because they too want to be a colonial power. They, as we've talked about before, Japan needs raw materials. It is an industrial nation at this time, but it does not have access to oil. It does not have access to minerals, things like iron. So they depend on imports. They depend on a lot of imports for this. So they're trying to take colonies to get these raw materials, but they're also going to be very angry when FDR places a trade embargo on Japan, because we're cutting off some essential supplies. A series of negotiations will be held between the military leader, Hideki Tojo, and FDR. These negotiations will fail. But Roosevelt's advisors are fairly optimistic. They're hoping that military action will be deferred. They're hoping this because they realize that our forces are not ready for war, not anywhere near ready for war. However, on December 7th, 1941, war comes to us. On this Sunday morning, 2,400 Americans die in the Pearl Harbor attacks, where the Japanese planes bomb our base at Pearl Harbor. Now, conveniently, a lot of our aircraft carriers were out at sea at the time, so that was good because it saved some of our vessels to then wage war against Japan. There are some conspiracy theories going around out there that the United States government knew about the attacks. They had a good idea that an attack was going to happen. They did not know when and where. They did not think it would actually be on U.S. soil. So just to dismiss any of those conspiracy theories, it was indeed a surprise attack, and it did lead to a declaration of war. And it's important to remember that war on Japan means war on all Axis powers, because by this point Japan has unified with Germany and Italy. So we are now launched into a world war. This begins the mass mobilization of American society, which will end the Great Depression. It puts everyone to work. It really, truly puts everyone to work. Not just in these make-work programs of the Great Depression, of the New Deal. It is going to provide opportunities for women and for minorities who had suffered greatly during the Great Depression. And so it's going to improve their status economically. It's going to improve their status, which is also going to translate to improving their status socially. And it's going to really give them the impetus to demand rights after the war. So, to begin and to really control mobilization, the government has to get involved. You see the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization. These are there to ensure that the necessary items are being produced for war. They set production quotas. They encourage people to go to work. They promote high efficiency in factories. Basically, what we're seeing is a lot of government intervention into the economy at this point. The government is, once again, like it did in World War I, taking control of the economy. Another way that they are going to do this is by implementing the cost-plus system. This is the system of using government contractors to carry out jobs for the United States and the United States military. This is something that we in Northern Virginia benefit from immensely. Probably many of your parents work for government contractors who are still doing much the same thing. They are building things for the U.S. military or for other facets of the United States government. Basically, this is implemented because the government realizes that the government itself is not the best entity to make stuff. Factories are much more well-equipped to build planes, to build naval vessels, and other things needed for war. So they're going to contract, essentially they're going to hire private companies to begin building these things. So, you know, if you drive down the toll road, you'll see a variety of government contractors today. Boeing, Raytheon, there's many others I could name. The government is also going to issue implement the Office of Price Administration. The Office of Price Administration, or OPA, will control wages. It will control keeping wages fair and high. Prices, it will keep farm prices rather high for food products. And one of the major things that it's responsible for is rationing. Because, as we talked about, in wartime, there's often a food shortage, and the OPA will issue ration booklets to every American citizen on the home front. And these ration booklets will include a certain number of stamps, depending on your age, gender, weight, height, that kind of thing. And basically those stamps equate to different food items that you can buy. Now, these are not food stamps. This does not mean that you are getting free food. However, every time you go and you buy a loaf of bread, you have to give over a stamp. So when all your stamps are gone for that month, you cannot buy any more bread. You'll have to be creative and find other things to eat. So it's a way to really enforce enforce consumption in moderation to ensure that Americans are not over-consuming and we can have more sent to the front. The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act allows the government to take over businesses threatened by strike. Now, you'll notice this is sort of in opposition to what we've talked about previously with FDR. FDR was very supportive of unions and having strong unions and allowing unions to strike. But during wartime, exceptions have to be made. And so this will be passed and it will stand throughout the war. The war will be financed largely in two ways. First, through increased income tax, and wages are rising, so income tax can rise as well, and through the selling of government war bonds. And we will look at a few of those posters here in just a second. African Americans are going to play a major role in this war. Now, there's going to be continuing migration of African Americans to the north and to the cities for jobs. This will lead to continued race riots. So even though it is a time of war, that does not negate the potential for racial hatred and racial violence, unfortunately. However, the African American leadership is going to initiate the WWII campaign. This is a campaign based on the slogan, "Victory over fascism abroad and victory over inequality at home." The idea being that if African Americans fight in a war, once again, they will gain the respect that is needed to hopefully gain rights and the end of Jim Crow. And you'll see that the NAACP expands, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, is established at this point. And so after the war, you are going to see some strides made for African Americans immediately after the war, but you're also going to see that the African American civil rights movement really has gained a lot of ground. The African Americans are tired of being oppressed, of having their rights stamped all over, and they are going to lead a much stronger civil rights movement than ever in the past. And ultimately, they will gain a lot of success after World War II. It will take a while, but we will see some strides being made. Mexican Americans, many Mexicans had been deported. Many Mexican citizens had been deported during the 1930s. As you remember, during the 20s, they had come up and worked in a lot of agricultural industries, but when American citizens wanted those jobs, the Mexicans were often deported. Mexican American citizens, however, that stayed in the countries, you'll see some of them working in the defense industry, some of them joining the military. We'll also see the U.S. government initiating a program called the Braceros Program, and this is a program that recruits farm workers from Mexico and brings them up to work during harvest season. Once again, farming, very important during wartime. Farmers are doing very well. They need all the help they can get. So the Braceros Program is implemented. But once again, you know, even though we are at war, even though we're trying to have national unity, this does not stop the growth of racist movements and racist actions on the part of white citizens. The Zoot Suit riots, this refers to a series of riots in the LA area, and they happen largely in a response to the growth of immigration, Mexican and Latin American immigration. And they happen largely because of this suit. If you look at the bottom picture, this piece of attire, which is called a zoot suit. And as you notice, it's a very baggy suit, something that is worn by, or was worn at the time by many Mexicans, Mexican Americans and Latin Americans. And whites a lot of times felt like this was highly unpatriotic to wear clothing that used so much fabric. Now, this was a time of war, which meant it was a time of conservation. It meant, you know, you scrimped and saved everything. You didn't buy new clothes. You didn't use excess fabric on your fashion. And to see things like this was offensive to many Americans because they felt like this was directly harming the war effort. So the Zoot Suit riots were waged against a lot of the immigrants at the time. Native Americans also contribute to military and defense industries. One of the most famous examples would be the Navajo Code Talkers. The Navajo Code Talkers were Navajo Indians who basically passed information back and forth across the forces fighting in the Pacific, and they did this in the Navajo language. The Navajo language is an oral language only. They do not have a written language. It is a very complex language. Thus, it was a great language for secret code because the Japanese were not able to break the code, and we were able to pass a lot of information that way. Women will enter the workforce at this time as well. You'll see them serving both in defense industries here at home. You will also see about 200,000 in military non-combatant roles. That means actual units that are working alongside the military in war zones, whether as nurses, secretaries, cooks, those other kinds of positions. They were not actually waging war, but they were definitely in the war zones and putting themselves at risk. The Rosie the Riveter song became a very popular song encouraging women to take jobs in the defense industry as well, and that's where that very popular poster comes from. And one of the reasons why it is so popular and this poster has caught on is because it really symbolizes the beginning of the women's movement. I mean, certainly women worked during World War I, and they did gain the right to vote after World War I. But after World War II, you're going to see women, really coming back with force and trying to demand their rights, demand equality, demand a choice in the business world, and a choice in their lives, whether or not to get married and have kids, or to go to work, or to do both. And that's really a demand that women are going to keep pushing for, and keep advocating for up until the present. There was also propaganda geared specifically toward women in those traditional roles. Women that were at home were expected to garden and preserve their vegetables for the winter so that they would not be taking away those precious food supplies that could be sent to the troops. You also have here on the left a poster that advocates that sort of waste not mentality. Don't throw in during wartime. You didn't really want to throw anything out. Everything, virtually everything, could be used in war supplies. And so during the wartime, a lot of women cleaned out their houses to find scrap metal, rubber, glass, and other things that could be donated to the war effort. I should also mention, too, it was not popular to buy new clothes or buy new shoes during wartime. That was seen as a waste. You wanted, all that production to go to the war effort. Shoes that were produced shouldn't be, shoes for women. They should be shoes for soldiers, and so it was seen as very unpatriotic to consume anything but the basic necessities at this time. And then over here on the right, you see a poster that really appeals to women, especially married women. If you notice the ring on her finger, she is a war wife who is being encouraged to get a job and not just sit there and long for her husband, but go actually do something to support the war effort to bring him back. Here are a couple pieces of propaganda encouraging women to join the various non-combatant units in the military. And this will, again, open up new avenues for women. A lot of the women that joined in these areas were generally younger, single women, but they offered, great opportunities for women to advance into areas that they never before would have thought possible. Here's some other pieces of propaganda. I like the racist caricature of the Japanese citizen. It's rather entertaining. Just how inappropriate propaganda could be. This is not something that would ever be seen today. But the idea there is that you have this guy saying, go ahead, please take a day off, because every day that an American worker takes off, every day that you don't show up to work at your war factory means, you know, another day that Japan has an opportunity to win the war. Then, of course, there's the car sharing or carpooling propaganda here. And this is really an attempt to save oil and gasoline, other things that are necessary for the front. So the ideas here are, you know, save, consume, do not consume, you know, make do with what you have, and work hard. So a lot of these traditional American values you can see very antithetical to the ideas of the 1920s. In the 1920s, it was all about, you know, consuming and being entertained and having fun. The 1940s are an era where that is just not done and not considered patriotic at all. These are a couple interesting pieces because they really speak to the growth of secrecy in the United States government. With the implementation of things like the Manhattan Project, which was the project to build an atomic bomb, thousands and thousands of people were put to work on the Manhattan Project. Most of them didn't know exactly what they were doing. Most of them were running machines, and they were just basically monitoring machines and having to keep, you know, a gauge within a certain number range. It was really menial, boring work, and they knew that they were doing something important for the United States government, but they didn't know exactly what. But the idea, if you were working in one of these places like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the bomb was being produced, or parts of the bomb were being produced, the idea was that you couldn't talk about it. You just didn't talk about work, because the idea is if everybody only knows a little piece of the plan, then it's much harder to piece together the whole plan. And if you don't talk about it, then you know, only a few people in the United States actually know what the Manhattan Project is actually about. And you want to do everything possible to keep this plan from getting into the hands of the enemy. This, of course, will initiate a very interesting debate in American life, because from this point forward, the U.S. government will employ a lot of secrecy in what it does. There are things that the United States government and weapons and technological materials that are built even today that we, the average American citizen, has no idea about. We have no idea about what our tax dollars are doing a lot of times, and thus we have no say in it, and we have no say in, you know, who these drones are killing a lot of times, or, you know, what the weapons are doing, or just how destructive they could be in the case of World War II. And so there is a lot of criticism that will come about as a result of the government's secrecy, because with secrecy comes a loss of accountability, and the government can essentially do whatever it wants within reason. And since American people don't know about it, they can't hold their legislators accountable. Couple other pieces of propaganda encouraging you to not waste, to conserve, which is why this generation of people, often called the greatest generation, they tend to be the type of people that don't throw anything out. And you know, this whole mentality, you know, even continues among some of the older generation today. They're very frugal people a lot of times. War bonds. Mentioned this earlier. War bonds are one of the primary ways that the United States government finances the war. Basically, the way war bonds work, and I think I've explained this before, but basically the way war bonds work is you buy a bond, and by doing that, and the bonds can come in various amounts, $20, $50, $100 or more, but by doing that, you are essentially giving the government your money to use for a period of time. So it's a loan. You're making a loan to the government. You do not have access to that money for the predetermined period of time. But after that period is up, the government will pay you back with interest. So it is a form of investment that can be very profitable depending on the interest rates at the time. Bonds are still used today and still something that Americans can invest in even to this day. A couple other examples of propaganda at the time. I think the I Need Smokes one is interesting. This was before it was really common knowledge that smoking was bad for you. So the idea was that, you know, you should conserve, you should smoke less here in America so that more cigarettes could be sent to the troops because, you know, we want to comfort the troops and aid them in any way possible. And smoking was seen not as harmful but as helpful to the troops abroad. So I'm going to stop this PowerPoint there because I want to break these up into smaller PowerPoints. So we will pick up with PowerPoint number 2 in just a second.